Imagine a world where everyone has a seat at the table, where different viewpoints are not only heard, but are actually taken into account when making political decisions. And that's perhaps the world we all think of when we think about democracy, but perhaps not the world we live in, right? The reality is very different. People might not have the time to participate in democratic processes. Politicians might have the wrong incentives. Conversations are maybe dominated by a few loud voices. So when we embarked on this journey, and the first paper that we published on this was even pre-ChatGPT, the world before sort of large language models dominated the public sphere. And we embarked on this journey and thought, what if we can use these models to make conversations more accessible, more scalable, and more inclusive? How would that look like in practice, right? So these are sort of abstract concepts, thinking about democracy and conversations. And as a starting point, we have this case study. And this case study is a case study where people naturally have diverse preferences. And these diverse preferences are in response to political questions. So let's say you have a question like, should the government provide universal free childcare from birth? Then different people will have different opinions on this topic, right? So some people might agree, some people might disagree, and they might agree or disagree for different reasons. So let's say you ask this question to 4 people and you collect 4 opinions. Then the question that we embarked on is whether you can design some sort of language model, large language model plus human system, and I'll go into more detail on what this system really is. And that system sort of takes a set of opinions and maybe even critiques from participants. So it's some kind of process in which the participants participate, and that takes these opinions and maps these to some group statement. And that group statement should maximize some notion of collective agreement among these participants, right? So the question is like, can you think of methods from language modeling, from AI, from social choice, and combine these to find some kind of group statement? We have, at training time, crowd workers, and when we evaluate the system, we also work with a nonprofit that sort of evaluates our system with a demographically representative group of people. But at training time, we use crowd workers that are paid online and that respond to political questions like, should we allow free childcare from birth? And these people participate in isolation, so they interact with a live large language model, but they don't see each other's opinions. So they write their opinion in response to a question. And then what the system, and we call the system the Habermas Machine, and what it does is that it takes a set of written opinions from these 5 people that wrote their opinions in response to this question, and it's tasked with mapping these opinions to a group statement. And we named the system the Habermas Machine after Jürgen Habermas, who is one of the most prominent thinkers on deliberative democracy and has really emphasized the importance of deliberation and conversation and consensus in democratic decision making. And the system has 3 components. And the first is a generative model. A generative model is similar to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, any of the models that you use. But then this this model is called Chinchilla, and it's an older model from DeepMind. It's from pre-ChatGPT days even. And this model initially is not fine-tuned, right? So it's not how you interact with one of your favorite models, that it responds in a way that it follows your instructions or it does exactly what you want it to do. But this model is still trained to predict the next token or the next word. So the first thing we need to do is to take this model and fine-tune it such that it generates high-quality consensus statements. We do this by letting it generate consensus statements. Then we show these consensus statements to people. These are the same people that provide their opinions. And then people rate them as high quality or low quality. We take the high quality ones, and then we go through a process called supervised fine-tuning to make the model to make it more likely that the model generates high quality statements. So that's how we have this generative model. It basically takes in a set of opinions via a prompt and then maps these to a high quality consensus statement. However, what we do is effectively a simulated election in the sense that we don't generate one statement, but we generate 32 different statements. And then we have a process that from these 32 statements that all sort of map these opinions in different ways to different group statements. And then we have a process that takes sort of the best statement from these 32 statements. And how we could get to the best statement is by something which we call a personalized reward model. And this, I don't know if there are people in the audience that have worked with these large language models, but a reward model is basically a model for preferences. So you put in a statement, and a normal reward model, you put in a statement, for example, a summary, and then the reward model says this is a high quality statement or a low quality statement. But with political opinions and political statements, people might disagree over what a good statement or a bad statement is, right? There might be statements that you agree with or that you disagree with. So our reward model isn't a model for quality, but it's a model for agreement, and it conditions on the opinions that people have. So let's say you have a specific opinion, then the reward model basically says, given your opinion, how likely are you to agree with statement A? Or how likely are you to agree with statement B? And this opinion conditioned reward model is also a large language model, and it's a large language model based on, it's a fine-tuned model, which is a sort of smaller version of Chinchilla. And now we have these sort of scalar rewards. So we have these like numbers that it outputs for how likely person A is to agree with statement B. But then you need to sort of aggregate this in some kind of way. So what we do is that we take all these scalar rewards, and then out of these scalar rewards, we create a ranking. So we say person 1 prefers statement C over statement B over statement E over statement A, right? So like you create a ranking for each person for all the different statements. And now there's a whole literature called computational social choice that thinks about how to aggregate rankings into sort of one final social ranking. So a ranking that sort of is shared across all people. And on the top of this social ranking is the winning statement, and that's the statement that ultimately the Habermas machine puts out. So just to reiterate, there's a generative model that generates multiple candidate statements. Then there's a reward model that ranks these statements hypothetically, right, based on what it thinks that people would like based on their opinion. And then we have a social choice function that outputs one winning statement, and that together all happens sort of behind the scenes, right? Participants don't see this process happening, but of course you could think about using this system in a way that participants would see it to make it more transparent, and it outputs one single group statement. At training time, we actually want to get signals from people that could help us train these models. So instead of doing this once, we actually do this 4 times. We get 4 different statements out of the Habermas machine, and then we ask people to rank and rate these different statements. And because we have people's opinion, we can then use this data to improve our reward model and our generative model. So in total at training time, we have about 2,500 participants, and they go through consecutive rounds of training the models, then going through a human experiment, collecting feedback, then training the models again until we have had 2,500 participants going through this process. So then if we go back to our example deliberation round, so should the government provide universal free childcare from birth, we had these 4 opinions, and now we know what that language model system is. It's the Habermas machine. And so now let's look at an actual group statement. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to highlight some aspects. It first sets the stage, so it says, in general, free childcare is a good thing, but it's important to consider how it's provided and for which age groups, right? So it sets the stage of what people are deciding on. Then it sort of mentions the values that are expressed by the different people. So it says, childcare should be provided from a young age, and it should be provided in a way that supports children's development and learning. Then finally, and this is a question we often get, is it just summarizing? Well, it's not summarizing, because each statement should communicate sort of a clear response to the question. So here it says, however, we do not feel that free childcare should be provided from birth. So if it looked at all the opinions and it found that statement, right, so sort of say, okay, it should not be provided, is the statement that maximizes agreement. However, then it also gives a specific alternative probably suggested by one of the participants, and it reasons that it's likely that the other participants will also agree with it. So it gives a specific sort of policy or implementation or an alternative. And then finally, it provides another value statement, and it says should be available to all parents irrespective of gender. Now, this is sort of a qualitative understanding. Now, MH will go through some of the more quantitative analyses that we did.
So in our paper, we structured our kind of evaluations around 4 research questions. Does AI-mediated deliberation help people find common ground? Does AI-mediated deliberation leave groups less divided? Does the AI mediator represent all viewpoints equally? And can this kind of support deliberation in a real-world virtual citizens assembly? And so we evaluated the model on about 2,500 participants. Again, these were all from the UK, and this data was collected April to October of 2023. The first question, does it help people find common ground? To benchmark the performance of the Habermas machine, there's no actual outstanding benchmarks of finding good common ground. This is sort of a new task. So the sort of best benchmark we could come up with was how well can a human do this task? So we compared the Habermas machine to a human playing the role of mediator. In this evaluation, we had 75 groups, each composed of 5 discussants and 1 mediator. The mediator was randomly selected from the same population of the participants, but they were trained with examples and instructions about what the task they were doing was, and they were financially incentivized such that if they kind of beat the machine, they could get a significant financial bonus. So in the task, participants saw 1 statement from the Habermas machine and 1 statement from the human mediator. In a sort of side-by-side preference, we found a slight but significant preference for the Habermas machine over the human mediator. When people rated the statements in isolation, the Habermas machine statement garnered stronger levels of endorsement. More people said they more strongly agreed with that statement. And then we had a separate group of external judges, so this is not the people in this process, a separate group kind of read the transcripts, and without knowing the provenance of the statements, kind of which was machine, which was human, they gave overall higher ratings to the Habermas machine statements along dimensions of clarity, informativeness, and perceived fairness. Now, the point is not that we have a superhuman mediator here, but rather something that's actually competitive with people, and it's a genuinely hard task. That this is something that people struggle to do. So actually, each group discussed a different topic. In this process, we had a data set of about 6,000 topics, although in practice, I think we only used 3,500. So we have a whole big book of political questions that each group we randomly selected a question for them to discuss. But they covered broad topics of social and political importance, things like climate change, the voting age, AI development, trains, is it okay to help to ask your neighbor to water your plants when in certain situations, so some more social questions. It's a big hodgepodge of questions. The second kind of aspect of finding common ground is sort of the deliberation process, and does the deliberation process is it a constructive process? And so what we've been talking about so far is really only the first stage of the deliberation process, where people wrote opinions and there was a group statement. But the sort of fuller process, the group statement was sent back to participants for them to write natural language critiques. So this is similar to their opinions. It's like a couple sentences expressing how they view the group statement. Oh, I largely agree with this, but I would want to see more along whatever. Then the Habermas machine takes in the critiques and generates a revision. And we found that the sort of second round group statement, what we call the revised group statement after critiquing, was overall preferred. If you'd like a side-by-side preference of the initial versus revised, people prefer the revised statement. However, that data alone is sort of not enough because people might prefer the revised statement because it sort of took longer to arrive at. It's sort of like you've spent more time on this project, so you're going to like the outcome, even though the outcome maybe isn't actually better. You just like spent a lot of time on it. So this is sometimes called an effort justification bias. So to control for this, we had another cohort where in the post-critique phase, Michiel mentioned we generate several statements in each phase. In the post-critique phase, participants saw a mixture of statements, some of which had the critiques incorporated and some of which had the critiques omitted. So they sort of, after having written the critiques, we like hid the critiques from the Habermas machine when it generated some statements. So in this task, we find again in the side-by-side preference that people prefer the statements that actually incorporated the critiques over those that omitted the critiques. Okay, so we found kind of two aspects of helping people find common ground. One is kind of performance at or maybe beyond human ability, and as well the critiquing improves the outcome. Their second question is, does AI-mediated deliberation leave groups less divided? Before and after the sort of whole experiment, participants completed a pre-deliberation and a post-deliberation survey in which they rated their position on the questions they would discuss. So for example, if one of the questions was, should we lower the voting age, participants rated on the Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree where they stood on this issue. We then created a metric which we call group agreement, which is the sort of difference in number of people who fall on the agree versus the disagree side of the scale. This is like a percentage point difference. So for example, if your group has 5 people, 3 disagree and 2 agree, this would be a 60-40 split or a 20 percentage point difference score. If the issue is perfectly divided 50-50, the score would be 0, so the group agreement would be 0. And if it was 100-0, it's sort of a unanimous group, they're all on the same side of the issue, the group agreement is 100. To our surprise, we found that the group agreement score actually increased at the end of the experiment in comparison to the beginning of the experiment. This actually replicated across 3 different versions of the task that we tried. And again, like the Habermas machine is not trying to achieve this. It's just trying to generate a statement that people will endorse. This is sort of like a side effect of the process. And there could be kind of 2 things going on here. It could be that people are being exposed to other people's perspectives. After all, this is like a group mediation deliberation protocol. Or it could be that, or like that and like the mediator is sort of adding something to the mix. Like the Habermas machine is presenting the information in a way that somehow makes people more open-minded to other people's viewpoints. So to kind of tease apart those 2 hypotheses, we compared to a group which we call the unmediated opinion exchange group. So this is a protocol, the same protocol people went through, but instead of seeing statements generated by the Habermas machine, they just saw each other's opinions and sort of rated those. So they're sort of being exposed to the same other viewpoints in the group. It's just, there's just no mediation. And in this condition, we found that the group agreement did not change from pre to post experiment. And this is confirmed by an interaction of exposure type on belief change, indicating that the Habermas machine is actually doing something substantive to sort of leave groups less divided. Now, in an exploratory analysis, we looked at the belief change back in the Human Mediator task, where we had the human, because we were wondering whether or not you would see similar belief change with the human mediator. Now, the experiment is not really designed to test this because, as you recall, it was people saw both the human and the Habermas machine statements, so they're sort of exposed to both statements. But we did see similar levels of division reduction in the rounds where the human won versus the Habermas machine statement won. And this gives us some indication with this caveat that like it's really the mediation process itself which is helping people, and that mediator in this situation could have been a human or an AI, doesn't matter. Summarized intermediately, we found the LLM mediation helps people find common ground, outperforming human mediation in some way, and that people change their minds with leaving groups less divided. So then we asked, what is the AI mediator doing? Can we kind of get some understanding of what's going on? So Most of the rounds in which we have people deliberate, there is some initial group disagreement. So there's people fall on different sides of the issue. Not for all the rounds, because these groups are of size 5, and within a 5-person group, you could just randomly get people who all happen to agree with each other. But in most of the rounds, there's some disagreement. So when there's disagreement, there is a majority and a minority coalition. It could be like a 3-2 split or a 4-1 split. In a large percentage of rounds, the majority would increase in size from pre to post deliberation. And we'd also find there's significant opportunity for the minority to sort of influence people. So people change their views, kind of gravitate more towards the minority. And so we asked what properties of the Habermas machine allowed for both minority and majority views to be expressed. To understand this, we looked into the embedding geometry of the statements. So we encoded the opinions, the human opinions, and the group statements, the Habermas machine statements, with an embedding model. So for example, sentence T5, though we tried it with a couple different embedding models. It's in the appendix. We then rotated the embeddings onto what we think of as a position axis. So how this looks is that you have this text embedding shown by this solid blue arrow, where you have the person's opinion, written out as they wrote it. I think young people could have a say as long as they're the ones, whatever. And then we draw a line between the statement that affirms the position, like we should lower the voting age, and a statement that negates the position, like we should not lower the voting age. So we draw a line between the affirming and negating statements, and we rotate the opinion text onto that axis to create this position component. So this is kind of the dimension of the text that we think taps into their stance on the issue. As a sort of sanity check, we find that the position embeddings from the text do strongly correlate with participants' position ratings in the pre and post deliberation survey. So these are the Likert ratings they gave in that questionnaire do strongly correlate with this dimension in the text of the opinions that they wrote. So that's an important validation there. We also compared how what the distribution of these position embeddings looks like in comparison to comparing the group statements to the opinions. And what you can see in this plot on the right is that the group statements, the initial group statements, and the revised group statements, especially after critiquing, is a much more narrow distribution, indicating that the group statements are less extreme in the opinion space than the constituent opinions, which we think represents that the Habermas machine is finding some kind of compromise between the opinions. The opinions are kind of more extreme than the output of the process. Finally, we were particularly concerned with an issue called majoritarianism, where democratic processes sort of amplify the strength of the majority without kind of representing minorities well. To analyze kind of the weight put on majority and minority opinions, we looked at the Habermas machine statements as convex combinations of majority and minority opinions. And we found that in the first phase, where participants write opinions, we found that the Habermas machine statements were sort of fair representations of the majority and minority opinions. So this line here is showing kind of the actual empirical proportion of minority opinions. And on the y-axis is the weight that the Habermas machine statements is implicitly putting on the minority opinions. And you can see it's the same number. In fact, it's exactly the same. But in the after critiquing, in the sort of post-critique phase, we find that the Habermas machine is actually overweighting minority opinions. And you might think, so there's a mental model that you might have where sort of the Habermas machine has this strategy of maybe first appealing to the majority in the group, and then by appealing to the majority, there's some backlash from the minority. So when the minority is writing their critiques, they're sort of more loud and vocal. And then the Habermas machine sort of responds in some way. And it might, it could kind of degenerate by switching too strongly to the minority, and then the majority would be unhappy. But if you, take this together with the results that from before that I shared, that the critiquing actually improves the overall outcome, that people prefer the post-critique statement, this is some indication that the Habermas machine is finding some effective common ground by responding to the minority, incorporating their opinions, but in a way that still respects the majority viewpoint. Okay, that was a real deep dive into embedding geometries. The final thing is we asked, can this AI mediation process help in a real-world citizens assembly? And to do this, we partnered with the Sortition Foundation, and we recruited a demographically representative sample of UK participants that were representative along 5 dimensions: gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geographic region. And this experiment, thinking of the question that came in at the beginning, what questions do they discuss? This experiment had a unique design where they all deliberated on the same questions. So we chose 9 questions for them to deliberate over. These touched on issues of raising the minimum wage, reducing the number of people in prison, should we apply to rejoin the EU, immigration, the retirement age, carbon neutrality, national pride. So these were kind of taken from previous rounds in the experiment that these were rated as very important questions and highly divisive. Overall, we found that there were some convergent shifts in opinion across groups for some questions. So the kind of top-level results replicated from the previous, that we analyzed in the previous kind of research questions, those all replicated. But we found some convergent shifts in opinion across groups, and I'll show you what that looks like in just sort of like raw percentage support. So for example, we found that there was an increase in support for reducing the number of people in prison, going from 60% support to 75% support, which is a pretty big shift. We also found that people felt like the UK should be doing more to encourage a greater degree of national pride, going from 42% to 57%, and a couple of other issues. So this is very interesting because it's sort of like different groups of people having different conversations, but all kind of moving in consistent directions, which is something that Habermas himself theorized about. We also were kind of concerned that these convergent shifts could be driven by the Habermas machine sort of overrepresenting certain positions on issues. So we did some bias analyses, and we found, at least in our analyses, that there was no evidence that, that the Habermas machine was sort of nudging people in a consistent direction. So to summarize these last 2 sections, the model responds to critiques by appealing to the minority while respecting the majority stance. And in a virtual citizens assembly, the process allowed people to find agreement on some controversial political issues. Of course, there were some very obvious limitations. These are all UK people deliberating in small groups. The form of deliberation is quite minimal. It's also not like face-to-face. And also the Habermas machine is something we can discuss more. It doesn't have other mediation relevant competencies, such as staying on topic or fact-checking or moderating the discourse. We think this demonstrates the potential of AI to enhance collective deliberation by finding common ground among people with diverse viewpoints. The AI mediation process is fast, fair, and scalable. It takes humans about 6 to 8 minutes to write one of those statements. It takes the Habermas machine seconds. And the Habermas machine demonstrated some intriguing mediation capabilities, not simply appealing to the majority, but also incorporating dissenting voices. However, if you want to use such a system in any sort of debate in order for it to be fair and inclusive, you must ensure that users are actually representative of your target population and that they're prepared to contribute in good faith. But under such conditions, we think that AI could improve collective decision-making across various domains, from contract negotiation to citizens' assemblies, and we think this is a promising tool for finding agreement and promoting collective action in our increasingly divided world.